Good afternoon, everyone.
Hey, Commissioner McFadden. Turn my volume up a little bit. I can't hear anything. So I actually think it's just us, Commissioner McFadden, today. And so I will then sort of go ahead and get us started. So first, hey, everybody. It is so great to see you all, and thank you for joining the November 16th Policy Committee meeting. I will start this meeting off by just sort of, again, thanking all the folks who have attended and also any of the public who might have joined us for this conversation. So with that, the meeting officially commences. And so today we'll have a discussion about policy IKA, which is around the grading policy, to really see a presentation and then to have some conversation about sort of implications around sort of what does this mean for our students and our families. And then we'll also have a policy, we'll be looking at policy FFA, which is about revisions and naming and renaming of school facilities. And then we have a number of policy, compliance reports for conversation at a later point. And so for our folks giving presentations today, I just want to remind folks, if you all can keep the presentations to about 20 minutes to allow for a robust time for discussion, I would greatly appreciate it. And with that being said, I will pass it over to whomever is doing our grading policy presentation.
Good afternoon. I'm Rachel Pfeiffer, the Executive Director of College and Career Readiness, and I will be kicking us off today. Let me go ahead and pull up the presentation.
Thank you.
Okay, are everybody able to see this and to hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you so much for the time today. There are a variety of policies that cover grading and retention and promotion and graduation, and we'll touch on these in a variety of ways today, policies IKA, IKEA, and IKEB. So this afternoon, I'd like to provide you with some context and just to share an update on some recent work that we've been doing related to grading. I'd like to circle back to how we have supported and continue to support students who earned a not complete or a no credit, denoted as an NC, this past school year, and would like to highlight changes to our graduation requirements as a result of state changes. So again, this conversation today is certainly aligned with the board's priorities as we think through the effective, relevant, and rigorous instruction that we want our students to get in the classroom and outside the classroom, as well as just thinking through the types of educational programming students get. You'll hear a little bit more about that as we discuss the summer. And then continuing to work toward equity at all levels, recognizing that what we put in policy and how we do our work has a direct impact on all of our students, and we want to do so in an equitable way that creates inclusive environments for their academic growth. So again, as I mentioned, there are three policies that inform our grading work. Grading and reporting is IKA, promotion and retention is IKEA, and graduation standards is IKEB. And for anybody who's looking for those, if you go to the board section of our website, Board Docs does contain links to all of those, but we use presentations like this just to make them a little bit easier to navigate and get updates on. So as you very well know, the pandemic disrupted teaching and learning in a variety of different ways. Some that we anticipated, some that we're still seeing the effects of. And we pivoted in March of 2020 with our incredible teachers and school leaders, our school staff really continuing to provide instruction to students through virtual platforms, in person when we were able to with our student learning centers, and through hybrid learning. What we recognized, though, and certainly we tried to get back to in-person learning as quickly as we could, opening up schools, and again, just kudos to our amazing school staff who made that happen for so many of our young people. But we do know that students continue to experience challenges during that time. Anybody who spent any time on these Zoom or Teams or whatever the platform may be meetings knows that they rarely go without an interruption. And if you imagine just interruptions more broadly extended for our students in a number of different ways as they navigated laptops and hotspots and variety of methods that we use to try and continue their learning during the time. We know that it wasn't just students' academic performance that was affected. However, we know that socially and emotionally, students have been affected by this pandemic. All of us have in a variety of ways. And we do see that in academic progress. And, certainly there are other ways that that is showing up as well. In school year 2021, there was a grading work group that met on a regular basis, made up of both school-based and district staff. Our teachers were key members of this, school leaders as well, in addition to district staff members, really to think through what did grading need to look like in the midst of the onset of the pandemic and a situation we'd never quite experienced before. One of the recommendations of this work group was to adjust grading regulations, and the recommendation that came forward was to use a not complete or a no credit as reflected by the NC. In summer of 2021, and I'll share more about this in a moment, we expanded our summer learning to provide students, and particularly those who had received an NC, with additional opportunities for learning, giving more time for instruction, and just opportunities for students to reconnect in an academic setting again. Many of these were in-person opportunities. We also provided grading guidance to schools related to what the NC looked like, how they needed to move forward in this very unusual time, and this is something that we will continue to do annually. As we look at this school year, our schools have developed and aligned their own grading policies in line with policy IKA. We have our district policy as essentially the base policy that is used everywhere, and schools are allowed to create their own school-specific policies that can be more rigorous or have additional requirements than the district policy, but can't go below what the district policy has in place. We also continue to prioritize supports for students who received NCs, and I'll speak more about that. And the grading work group is meeting again and is thinking through what grading could look like in city schools in the future. And so that conversation is one that we will continue to share with the board as it develops. To talk a little bit about how the grading group and how the decision was reached to use the NC, and to think about grading adjustments in general. Part of it was thinking through the work group's recommendations and discussing with a number of different stakeholders how we might adjust our grading practices this last spring to avoid being punitive for students who were failing in the midst of an incredibly challenging time, to avoid unfairly retaining students. And certainly at the Teaching and Learning Committee, we've shared a little bit about retention and how it is not as effective as our students need in helping them to move forward and progress in their work, which is why we're using an acceleration approach. We also were committed to providing a personalized multi-year plan for students to complete their unfinished learning. And I really want to emphasize multi-year. In this, we don't believe that the impact that the pandemic has had will be resolved in simply 1 year. And so providing our young people with personalized plans to help them get where they need to go academically is part of our commitment and part of the thinking behind some of the grading adjustments. So the NC for grades 2 through 8 meant not complete. And it was just a reflection that there was still unfinished learning, that there was still more learning for our students to complete that just was not gained during the pandemic for a variety of different reasons. And so we took that into account and thought through how we could provide supports for those young people, but using the NC to say, you know, there's still more that we wanted you to learn this year, and we're going to take the initiative to support you in continuing that learning as you move forward. For grades 9 through 12, for our high school students who receive credits, an NC meant no credit, and students who received an NC saw that on their report cards instead of an F, and needed to repeat the course in order to gain the credit for that course with a passing grade. So just to share with you a little bit of data to frame what grades looked like at the last year, 46.3, nearly half of our 2nd through 5th graders received an NC in at least one course. And you see as the grade levels go higher, so do the the percent of students who received an NC in at least one course in grades 6 through 12. So one of the things we finished last school year and went into the summer being very clear about was that there was unfinished learning that we needed to support our students in gaining. So to that end, we provided more summer opportunities than we ever have before. More than 17,000 students were engaged in district-provided programming this past summer. And we increased the length of programs for, so students were engaged for 5 to 6 weeks in these opportunities. As I mentioned at the beginning, we know that the impact of the pandemic has not been strictly academic. And so these opportunities weren't just about getting more academic instruction in that period of time, but also about re-engaging, giving students the opportunity to build relationships with peers and adults again, and social emotional learning, with the aim that we would be able to create the conditions and the opportunities for students to begin their academic recovery. When we look at what happened at the high school level related to credit recovery, we provided 2 3-week in-person sessions for students to engage in over the summer. We created a number of different options to be able to meet the needs that students had. So one site allowed students to start a little bit later so that they could do some work in the morning. Another site was specifically focused for seniors and with associated resources to help them think through life after graduation and begin to plan for that. There was a virtual program for our high school students that ran for 6 weeks, and there was so much demand for these credit recovery opportunities this past summer at the high school level that we actually opened an additional site for the second session in response to what we heard from students and families in terms of their desire to be able to get enrolled and continue their learning over the summer. You can see the pass rates here to the right. What that led to in very exciting news was the opportunity for more of our students to graduate during our summer, our August graduation than we have ever seen. We had 505 students who received a diploma or certificate, which is, as you can see, 75% increase from last year and 120% increase from 2 years ago. We know the significance of having a high school diploma or a certificate that a student walks away with, and just the opportunities that that opens to them. And we were really excited to be able to come alongside our young people who were demanding these summer opportunities and really took them up and made the most of them. As we look at this school year, we know that the pandemic continues. And so we are continuing to provide support for students who earn that NC, students who may have that unfinished learning, in a variety of ways. Listed here, you see diagnostic assessments for monitoring student progress and really allowing our teachers to use them to inform how they're teaching and what they're focusing on in lessons. We have rolled out student learning plans so that every student pre-K through 12 has an individualized plan. The first round of those plans will be completed by the end of December. We have, as I mentioned earlier, a focus on acceleration, on helping students to continue their learning at grade level while providing just-in-time supports for learning that they may have missed along the way that shows up as missing skills or missing content. We have time every week for small group instruction and personalized learning. And we are launching tutoring, mentoring, and extended learning opportunities for our young people and increased number of opportunities for credit recovery as well at the high school level. So I'm going to pause for a moment to switch gears to policy IKEB, which is our graduation policy, as I referenced at the beginning. As we have been looking at this work and making changes, the state has also been reflecting and considering changes to graduation requirements. And wanted to make sure that we included that as part of this policy discussion with you as well. So our graduation requirements align with what the state requires. The state's requirements are codified in what's called COMAR. And the two changes that I wanted to highlight for you are a new health graduation requirement. So in addition of 0.5 credits required for students who are starting their 9th grade year this year, so that they will have to complete 1.0 credits in health instead of 0.5. And associated with that is a 0.5 elective that the state has added to balance out the number of credits required for graduation to 22. There are also changes to CTE credits required. Previously, students needed to complete 4 credits in our career and technical education programming that is preparing students with skills for the workforce. With these state changes, the state is now requiring that students complete a state-approved CTE pathway. Now, that pathway may require 3 credits, or it may require up to 9 credits. There are a variety of different pathways that we have. We have a little over 30 here in Baltimore City, and now our students will just be responsible for completing the pathway that they select rather than having to do 4 credits specifically in order to graduate. So wanted to highlight that for the policy committee. We will be bringing language for your review and for board approval for IKEB, but fundamentally, we want to make sure that we are aligning our policy with the state, and we want to make sure and just really want to reiterate our commitment to making graduation requirements public and easier to access. So as we make these changes, we will make that easier for families to be able to see as well, so that everyone is very clear on what the requirements are for students to move towards graduation. So in addition to what I just mentioned related to IKEB, there are some regulation changes. The regulations are the practical implementation directions for how we make our policies happen. And we know that there are some opportunities that we have to clarify our policies and just make the language clearer. And so we're looking at some of the following changes. For the grading regulation, we want to make sure that the regulation is aligned with new forms that provide guidance on how to make grade changes for schools, that we clarify the appeals process. So if there is a concern about a grade, where to go and what the process is. And we will be coming back to the board at the end of first semester with an update on how, if and how the NC will be used moving forward. The first semester ends at the end of January, so you can anticipate that conversation coming after that. And then, as I noted, changes to the regulation, to the graduation regulations, to make it clear that the COMAR guidelines are the basis upon which our policy is developed, and also to clarify the appeals process for graduation. Again, these are all just changes to make things clearer, make them tighter, make them easier to understand for our students and families in schools. So I will pause there and very happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you so much for the presentation. And so Commissioner McFadden, it's only us. So we get to be in conversation with Rachel. Anything come up for you, Commissioner McFadden, as you watched the presentation?
No, a lot of this has been presented to us already in a previous committee. What I have a question, Dr. Pfeiffer, about, go back to the slide right before this, please. Right, so these updates, so can you talk a little bit more, elaborate just a little bit more? Will we be seeing these updates? When I see the decision on the use of NC at the end of first semester, are we going to use data and information that we have received from the end of last year, throughout the summer, the beginning of this year, to kind of set us up for how we may consider moving forward?
That's exactly right. So the policies come to you, to the board for votes. The regulations we will certainly share and want to enter into conversation with you about. Those don't require board votes, but we would want to keep you updated as to how the shifts are being made. And so this is an initial just an initial highlight so that you know what's coming, and then we'll provide additional information, particularly about that use of the NC when we have more data to see, when we have more data from this school year.
Because that could thank you, because that could potentially impact graduation rates potentially over time, depending on what the regulations look like for NC. So I appreciate you all keeping us in the loop along the way, as that is certainly a part of the board's priority, making sure that our young people certainly are graduating with high school diplomas and are prepared for college and career. So that will just be something that is on my radar. But that's it for me, Dr. Brooks.
Awesome. And so thank you for that. I had a couple of questions around clarity. And so I don't know which slide. I think I'm looking at the PowerPoint. It's on slide 11, but it's the summer recovery, summer credit recovery for students who received NC, that slide.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so could you talk to me a little bit about sort of the number of students who went through this process? Do we have any data and insights around how many, because of the taking advantage of the summer learning opportunities, how many of them actually either did better in their coursework or sort of had a material difference in their academics because of the summer course? I know I saw the 505 for the graduation, but of this larger end over here, yeah. So I'm just trying to get a little bit of sense of that.
That's a great question. We don't actually have that data right now. So our first quarter just ended, and so we need to kind of get that data to understand how students did in this first quarter. But I appreciate that question, and I'll take that back just to see what the impact of attending credit recovery may have been. One thing I would caution, just in terms of one of the challenges in making that connection, is that I'll use myself as an example. I was picked up pretty quickly when I was in school in Algebra 1 and got that, but geometry was a whole different ballgame for me. So I think that, if we see, for instance, a student who's gone through credit recovery in algebra, that doesn't necessarily mean that their next course in their sequence will automatically be one in which they do better just because of the different content. But I think we certainly could take a look at where student grades are after this first quarter to get a sense of where students are and how that might align with credit recovery participation.
Yeah, so Dr. Pfeiffer, that's really helpful. And I guess what I'm trying to get at is, how do we know our intervention works, right? And so this was a huge endeavor. We had so many more students participate. What was the real impact? And I think I appreciate you mentioning earlier that it wasn't always about the academics, but the social emotional pieces and sort of the ability to re-engagement. Then my next question is then sort of, how are the students who went through this adjusting? Are they adjusting similarly or differently because they had more experience regulating their social emotional aspects? Again, I think we need to clarify sort of what are our social emotional learning approaches and to have better measures so we can see shifts over time. But then also to think about, for example, for the students who were even, did we see increased attendance because they went through the intervention over the summer? So I guess I'm trying to get us a little bit more feasible because I see the story around the 505 and I'm like, yes, that's incredible.
Right.
Like how many of those students who did the 505 were participated in this and if there were any connections and so forth. So yeah.
Understood. So I can actually tell you the overwhelming majority of the 505 did take classes during the summer, which is how they were able to graduate. The other note that I would, because these are students who didn't make it in the June graduation, right? So they needed additional credits in order to get the credits required for graduation, and they got those during the summer. The other piece that I would point out is just progress toward graduation, right? Twice a year, our students sit down with their counselors and have a conversation about where they are in terms of being on track to graduate. And so for each of these students who passed a course, at least one course during the summer, that meant that, if if they had missed out on earning credits that previous year, they had the opportunity to get back on track. You know, when we start to look at the credit recovery courses that schools are running this school year, I think we'll be able to provide an additional page, if you will, to the story of how students are engaging and opportunities to make up these courses. But I do think that, you know, we need to do more conversations with students, certainly, but being able to come into this high school year, having had the opportunity to earn 2 or 3 credits over the summer, certainly put students in a much better position than coming in maybe having failed, or excuse me, received an NC or no credit on all 5 classes the previous year, and feeling like they were in a little bit more of a hole. So appreciate your questions. I don't have enough data to give a you know, impact on student social emotional well-being right now, but I do think that I am jotting those down, and I think we'll bring back what we can about how the summer had an impact on student engagement.
Great, thank you for that. Dr. Dabrowski?
Yes, thanks so much for letting me jump in. And I do appreciate the questions as well around how are we able to measure the impact of summer, which is, I think, a really important question that has existed forever as summer programs. And we know that often summer programs can help mitigate learning loss, but they often don't necessarily lead to gains. And so there's some of that noise that's hard to look at in the data. I will say, though, that the space around actually the course earning is probably the strongest space that we can look at very concrete data that says we know this many credits were earned. But we are thinking a lot about how we can do tighter post or pre and post, if you will, summer learning experience and track that over time as we're thinking about going forward. So I just want to appreciate the question because it's the exact right question. How do we know that the summer learning is making a difference? I think in our secondary numbers here for high school, we can see it simply by the number of courses that were passed this summer, which exceeds what we've had in previous. So I just wanted to sort of echo what Dr. Pfeiffer was saying and say that at the K-8 side of things, it's a little bit more incomplete and messy, and we've got to tighten and think about how we do that going forward, especially as we want to think about the academic recovery work.
Great, thank you. That's really helpful. And I think, Dr. Pfeiffer, as you were talking about the story, I'm thinking about the story that we want to be able to tell about our the folks who are young people who've who've sort of accessed those resources, and the credit recovery, sort of how many new, starting at a different place, that feels like concrete. That we can actually, do that. And so I thank both of you for naming that. I think another part of my question is, again, in a similar vein, but it's looking at can someone really describe for me sort of the racial demographic breakdowns of sort of the experiences of our young people in there, is it reflective of our general student population, or did we see any sort of differences in racial ethnicity and so forth?
Yeah, no, I believe we have the data. Again, we're just trying to be mindful of how much data to pile into all this. I think we can certainly get those subgroup populations for you guys to make sure that we have that. I know we were trying to strike a balance of how much and all that, but we can certainly get that for you. Yep.
Great. Thank you. And I guess again, sort of my position here is really for the purposes of did we notice any trends or any differences? I think it would matter if the number of our Black students had sort of matriculated at different rates or vice versa. So so I guess I'm trying to say not just requesting data for the purpose of that, but really what are the implications?
What are the patterns and trends?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay.
Absolutely.
Great. And then I guess for me, the last thing that I would just want to lift for this is, let me look at the other slide. Where did it go? So when we got to slide 12, which is a summer 21 graduation rates, and we have the 505 students on there, and we saw the 120% increase from 2 years ago. I'm just curious about what types of learning and sort of are we sort of pulling from this? And then what are we keeping to carry on to make sure that we still have young people accessing credits, and sort of what are we, and yeah, just kind of like what are we thinking here? Because I think that's really, really inspiring that we can actually get more folks through the door with meaningful education.
Yeah, so there are a few things that I think we can take away, or that we have taken away from this. One is we can just continuing to promote the summer graduation opportunity. It can be absolutely devastating as a young person to not have the credits in June, in May, essentially, to walk with your class in June. And part of the importance for us of having what we call this rainbow graduation, where graduates wear their school colors and you can see the colors of the rainbow across the field as the students represent their schools, is that these students absolutely must be celebrated in the same way that we celebrate graduates in June. And so continuing to promote that, making that, we held it, at Loyola provided space for us to do it. It was a great venue. There were, it's a graduation. There's nothing about it. There are speakers. Our CEO and board members joined as well. And so that's something that we certainly intend to continue. And for those who aren't aware, we actually have a graduation in February as well for students who finish at the semester. I think another real win for us this past year was having seniors in one site, and not just having the site for seniors, but having the supports for seniors, so that seniors were able to meet with counselors, meet with representatives from our Navigator Center, which supports students with post-secondary transition. So it wasn't just about getting the credits, it was also about making sure that students had a plan for what they were going to do after they walked across that stage. And that type of support and continued supports for students during summer school is something that we want to continue to provide. I will just say that our students heard us loud and clear when we said that we were providing them opportunities to continue their learning over the summer. And you heard me reference that we actually ended up opening another summer school site because there were so many who wanted to attend. And I think just continuing that momentum of letting young people know what opportunities there are to recover credits, to continue learning, to take opportunities during the summer to be in a better place for the fall. Our young people responded well, and we want to continue to provide what they are looking for.
And I'll just add that I think I want to just give a huge kudos to Dr. Pfeiffer and Dr. Ohanian from our summer learning, who worked together to sort of build it. And I'll use one of my references to a favorite movie. If you build it, they will come. And they came. They came in record numbers. And I think that's our young people showing up, and then the team being responsive to get another site, to get more teachers. And I think I'm so excited for how we can build on that momentum as we go into next summer.
That's really great. And I think what strikes me as super important, and want to sort of, again, like as you all mentioned, the continuous, like, what does the real support for seniors look like? It is surprising how, like, when we're navigating as young people to think about our educational credits and so forth, and somehow we show up and it's like, oh my goodness, it's time to graduate, and I don't have all of these things. And sort of also knowing the realities of some of our counselors are having really large caseloads. And so any way in which we can continue to invest at that level to make sure that our seniors have the type of wraparound supports, whether it's a physical location or the same concept, I think we'll be better off for it in the long run. So I just wanted to say thank you all for that, and so thank you all for the presentation. Commissioner Vice Chair McFadden, did you have any more questions or thoughts? Awesome. Well, thank you, Dr. Pfeiffer. Thank you, Dr. Borowski, for chiming in as well, and really appreciate everything that y'all are doing.
Thanks so much.
Awesome. And so,
One second, Dr. Brooks. Dr. Pfeiffer, you mentioned the February graduation for those students who finished semester. I'm sure that we've received that as a board, but do we have a date for that event yet?
Yes, give me 1 second. I'm just going to pull it up in my calendar so I don't get you the wrong one. I will,
Send it to us.
yeah, I will send it to you. I'll actually put it in the chat so I don't take up any more of your time here, but it is on my calendar. So I'll get it to you. Absolutely.
Take care.
yeah, and thank you. And thank you, Commissioner McFadden, Vice Chair McFadden. Also, like, the sooner that we can get those, we can put those on the calendar. If you want us to be there, I think it'll be easier for us to actually show up. And so we want to make sure that we show up in force for all of the graduation ceremonies where possible.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you. And so next, I think sort of we have sort of policy FFA, which is around sort of our naming and renaming facilities, policies, and regulations. And one, it says just open, any sort of questions. I don't know if anybody is here to sort of like lift this or say anything particularly about it. Or do we just dive into questions? I feel like I've been gone for so long.
Yes, actually, this is Monique Riley. I'm sorry. Yes, we are. We're walking in the building now. We just came from our community meeting. So give us a couple of minutes to get set up and we will start our presentation soon.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Monique. Hey, Chief Seven. Oh, you're on mute.
Perhaps while we're waiting, we could go to some compliance reports and circle back just to make sure we use the time.
Yeah, for sure. And so how about we start, Commissioner McFadden, did you have any initial thoughts? Because I didn't want to start with the longest ones first. I think where we enter here.
It's up to you, however you choose to go through them. I didn't have questions about all of the reports, but a couple of them just had some questions. So if you want to go through them one by one, that's fine. If however you choose to start, it's up to you.
Awesome. Okay, so given that we will have, how about we start with 3.09 compliance report for school police. I had a question here. I was mostly around just kind of helping me understand sort of this last piece, and I know that the diversions. If someone could just talk to me about sort of what that really means and what does that really look like, that would be really, really helpful. I know that we didn't have, I mean, because of school was out, we didn't really see a lot of like arrests, but like what does the diversion actually mean and entail?
Commissioner Brooks, this is Christian. I don't think we have all the compliance report authors, and because some folks perhaps look at the agenda and might be doing later. So
okay,
if we want to just perhaps flag the ones you have questions about, or I know we have Chief Sivan here, so the ones where the authors kind of answer questions, but I don't think all the authors have arrived yet.
I believe Chief Ham is here. Chief Ham, if you are able to weigh in.
I don't see Chief Ham, but unless that's the phone number.
Okay, well, we can come back to that. So,
hello?
But I guess.
Oh. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
I'm sorry. Good evening, everyone. This is Chief Ham. And just to speak on the question in reference to the diversion process, what used to happen was if a child, if there's a fight and a parent feels like their child was assaulted in the past, what would happen is we would write a report, give the parent a complaint number, and the parent would go to Department of Juvenile Services and file criminal charges. What we do now is, if depending on what the crime is, if it's a misdemeanor, which means if it's a minor crime, we automatically send these cases to teen court, restorative practices, all those type of programs, and instead of sending the children down to DJS. Now, of course, we cannot stop a parent from going down there, but what our policy is, we don't send anything down to them. We automatically send them to diversion.
Great, thank you. That's really helpful. And I know that this year, like we didn't see any data because of the way that the pandemic sort of in the real data in the compliance report, even though it said it was 3 diversions, employ 4 types. So I guess sort of one of the things that I'm thinking about sort of for the future of this compliance report, sort of it says that we would have data that's, you know, broken down by diversion type and sort of where they're going. I think what would be helpful in this particular compliance report is to have sort of some of the way that the data is structured to be broken down by all of those demographics that are listed and above, and then to also then have those attached to sort of like my law or responses or department and conflict and resolution to see those sort of broken down so that I can actually see where people are going out of a total number of moments. And so I guess just because we don't have that data at the moment, I can't see it in the compliance report, but I think structurally moving forward, it would be nice to make sure that there's a clear pathway for where folks are going, broken down by all the demographics that you have listed in there, so that we can see sort of the impact of that and sort of what is it, and really what does it mean for folks to really be diverted versus to have this other process going on. I think it would be really helpful to have a little bit of story.
And that's not a problem because we already do that with student arrest. So it's just a matter of us using the same breakdown that we use for student arrest for diversion, because we already send that to the state every year.
Great. So I guess so for next round it would just be Christian. Could you capture that in sort of like for whatever the next iteration of the next round of a compliance report, that we have those different dimensions broken down?
Yeah, so what I'm just looking at the summary report. So pretty much you just want, you want all that information filled out in a kind of attached spreadsheet. That's what I'm hearing.
Yeah, it could be a spreadsheet
now,
or yeah.
Okay.
Now, I don't mean to interrupt, but here's the thing, and this is what I need help with. We don't have access to special ed records. So if they have a 504 or if they have some kind of special need, I would need some office to chime in and help my office with that because we don't have access to that.
Is that something reasonable of an ask? I don't know if that's how reasonable. So Christian, I'll let you weigh in there.
So it seems like it's an internal process, right, Dr. Brooks, where when we identify students perhaps that have been arrested, do we cross-reference them perhaps with the chief of schools off, someone else, just to see if that student is receiving special education services or if they have maybe a BIP or a 504 in place to support the compliance report overall?
Thank you, Commissioner McFadden.
But I'm not sure if we can do that or if we're not going to do that. I mean, that I think that's the ask that Dr. Brooks is asking. Like, will we be able to, once Chief Ham is able to get, those arrests to us, are we then able to, it seems like it will be simple, cross-reference to see whether or not those students have an IEP or if they have 504s?
We will work that out. There are, as Chief Ham notes, some limitations under student privacy law in terms of school police records versus student records, but we'll work it out and get back to the committee on what we can do.
I think it could be helpful. I appreciate that, Chief, just to see perhaps the percentage of students. We may not necessarily have to identify students specifically, but just the percentage of students maybe receiving special education services. Those are the students that may have been arrested for whatever the offenses are, right? Or students who have 504 plans. They were, arrested for whatever the percentage or the number. Maybe we don't have to specify, but at least we could have that information.
We will definitely take those and see what we can do. And the aggregate seems like a good approach, as Commissioner McFadden mentioned.
Go ahead.
No, with that same report, so we see that in 2021, there were no arrests, but then I see the data from oh, never mind, I just answered my own question. So these are the arrests that have occurred this particular school year, and that's what we see in the data, correct?
Yes, sir.
Hey, Chief, and so also, like, when we see the arresting offense, we see the numbers here, but are we able to actually know what those offenses are?
Yeah.
Moving forward, I mean, not necessarily now, but just moving forward, when we see the arresting offense, what we see from our level is just the number, but I think it could be helpful for us to continue to, just analyze data to notice trends, what the actual offenses are, because perhaps we could support, in the way we target resources for specific things, if that makes sense.
It does make sense, Commissioner, and the last arrest we made was at Digital, and the student bought a loaded handgun in the school, and we arrested the student for that. So I can understand where you're coming from, where you want to know, because we're not arresting students for low-level offenses.
Precisely.
We're only arresting them for serious offenses.
Yeah, and I think sort of where this kind of lives in my, the overlap, right? So if we are able to sort of better map and coordinate sort of the young people who might be engaging in behaviors that are putting other folks at risk with their particular plans, I'm also thinking about how do we sort of, again, we understand that there's the school to prison pipeline, and we know there's data associating students who are might have different disabilities or differently able to sort of get into these systems. Like, how do we then sort of create either interventions before this or make any adjustments to any prior plan? So I think I'm thinking more specifically around sort of the mental health supports and the additional opportunities that we might be able to do when we sort of have the data sort of connected to some of to whatever degree possible, Chief Seven, the aggregate around like who's actually participating in these and if there are disproportional rates in there. Yeah. Oh, great. Did you have anything else?
Chief Ham?
Say again?
It's good to hear your voice, that's all.
Good to hear, good to be heard.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much, Chief Ham. I don't have any additional questions on the compliance report.
All right. Everybody have a good evening.
You too. All right. And so are we ready for our presentation for our revising and renaming?
Yes, I can pull it up. And I believe our team is here. So I'll start sharing my screen and we can go from there.
Great.
Good afternoon, commissioners. I'm Angela Alvarez. I'm the executive director of the Office of New Initiatives. I am joined by Chief Sivan. You may want to say hello.
I'm sorry. Hi, everyone. My name is Monique Riley. I am in the Office of New Initiatives. I'm a specialist under Angela Alvarez. Nice to meet everyone.
Chief, sorry, I didn't know if you wanted to just say hello.
Oh, I apologize. Hello.
And we're also joined by Ben Goldberg from OAA.
Hello, thank you for having us.
And so we, we came to the board last year, I think last April, to kind of share this initiative around naming that we're a small part of a larger cross-functional team who've come together to kind of, one, look at the policy, but two, look at some other sort of components. And so as you can see just from our introductions, you see O&I represented, legal. Our equity office is also part of this work. Our, they changed the name, so it throws me off a little bit. Our communications, engagement, and enrollment office is also part of this work. And so we have a mighty cross-functional team really helping us to sort of think deeply. Academics is also represented within this body of work. And so we're going to walk you through a little bit about what we've been doing in terms of this initiative and kind of where we are in our timeline that we shared last year. The team is going to kind of walk you through some of our proposed changes that come out of a lot of engagement we did starting last year. Some of the work that our Be More fellows have done, and then where we're going for the future. This work is aligned to the board priority 7, where City Schools is continuously working toward equity at all levels by implementing policy, practices, and procedures that create a welcoming and inclusive academic and professional environment. One of the overarching goals that has been leading us in our thinking about this work is ensuring that all of our school names honor the dignity and aspirations of our community and empower student voice in the naming process. And so we had 3 key goals that we've been working on. One was to create a more robust process for the consideration of school names so that there's real thought and care that goes into them, since they can stick with our buildings for a long period of time. And we've been going through a lot of change. And so making sure that we're really thinking through and have a process that guides community through deep introspection and reflection in the consideration of names. Goal 2 was to make sure that the work around this aligns to our equity policy and our equity work, and to lean into that a bit in words and in the practices of the policy. And then our goal 3, we've been going through a lot of changes in the district and merging new school communities, closing schools and creating new schools. And that has, meant a loss of some of our history. So one of the things we've been trying to do and are trying to ensure gets implemented in this policy is to have a methodology for documenting, maintaining, and displaying our history of city schools through how we maintain and display our school names and the history of the names, and being more intentional in that work. And so in the consideration of people that we once honored in our schools, that we no longer have our buildings named after, that there's real consideration, and also just even understanding who the people are that our schools are named after. And so we'll talk more about that towards the end of the presentation. And so we are in the 3rd phase of this work. So we, in phase 1, established that cross-functional team that I started at the beginning. We researched what was happening nationally, because school names and the names of buildings and other monuments have been a national conversation as well as a local conversation here in the city. So really understanding what other people were, how other school districts were handling this and how other communities were handling these processes. We developed a framework to engage the community, helping us think through how we tackle these kind of real questions and focus through use of an equity lens in those conversations. Some of you participated in those meetings. And we also wanted to build awareness with community around what the process is and what happens and just the things that we're wrestling with. During that same time, our fellows engaged in research about school names and documented some of our school names. There's still work to do, but there was a really good first start, and it got them real experience in doing historical research and why that would be important in a real connected to self way. And that team also developed a website that we still haven't draft, but we're in the process in the initial development of that has been established. We went out and did a lot of community meetings to sort of get community feedback in our early thinking. And so it was our first round of engagement, and we tried to engage cross sections of community and small, thoughtful conversations. And now here we are in phase 3, sharing some proposed revisions to the policy that came out of those discussions. As a result of what happens in policy, we'll begin to work on guidance documents to sort of go along with the practice of implementing and what comes out of the final decisions around the policy itself. This is a little bit about the stakeholder engagement that we did last year, just feedback. So we had a good cross section of parents, school staff, and community partners participate in these discussions. Our student fellows also did these discussions to share feedback on the different equity questions and coming up with different ways for us to again, deepen the process. The Be More Fellows also, as part of their year-long fellowship, participated in having these discussions and working with people who do historical work in partnership with the Afro and the Enoch Pratt Library. We shared for these policy revisions. We've also have met with PCAB and our student council as the first part of our policy discussions, in addition to these community meetings that we started last year, those small group conversations that helped us come up with the initial set of recommendations that you see reflected here, both in the policy and in some of the things we plan to implement in terms of like the website and how this will function.
As Ms. Alvarez mentioned, this work occurs in a national and local context. And so we wanted to just recognize here, as you all recall, we've come several times to the policy committee to give an update and feature the national and local context there. So here we just remember that really there's been a lot of conversation locally, regionally, nationally about who deserves a monument, and that work has informed the work we are doing and thinking about in terms of renaming, and that this work, and we paid attention to it, has been occurring in school districts across the country. And we list a range of school districts ranging from Detroit to Topeka, Kansas as school districts that we have paid attention to, as well as efforts locally in the city of Baltimore. Then we also wanted to situate this work in really the history and the strong legacy that Baltimore City Public Schools has in naming schools and celebrating by those names prominent educators and activists with local connections. You see some of them featured here, from Frederick Douglass to Dr. Nathan Pitts Ashburton, Mary E. Rodman, Lily Mae Carroll Jackson, and then most recently, Billie Holiday, formerly James Mosher School, was recently added to our portfolio of names. As you know, the legendary jazz singer and also civil rights activist who grew up in Baltimore and creator of the first prominent protest song, Strange Fruit of the Civil Rights Movement.
So here is a summary of the proposed changes that we want to talk about today. So first, we included new language in the purpose and the standards portion of the policy to align it more closely with our equity policy ADA. We also modified Form 1, used at the beginning of the process and submitted by the school leader, to include justification and rationale. And then we modified the reg to include standards about the use of Form 1 and the newly added Form 2. Next, we added the ability for students and school staff to submit a request to start the renaming process. We added a provision that requires community to justify a name using justification consideration questions. And an additional provision requires that all naming and renaming meets, or after an individual, meets the legacy test questions. And then finally, we added Form 2 to capture more of that justification for a name prior to the board vote. And Form 2 is also intended to be a sort of a guide for communities to deeply engage when considering a school name.
Okay, so just to talk a little bit more about how the language is tied more closely to our equity policy. So it's added in two places in the policy itself, in the purpose section, as well as in the standards. And in the purpose, we are stating here that we want our school programs and facilities to honor the dignity and aspirations of the community. And then also that the voices and aspirations of students and school communities are empowered throughout the process, recognizing that school names really help create a shared identity for our schools and school communities. And then in the standards section, we are, affirming the equity policy, stating here that the board is committed to taking action to disrupt and dismantle inequities in every area of our work. And what we want to say is that consistent with that commitment, the proposal is that new names or renaming of school buildings, as beginning this year, if this new policy is enacted, those names will not be able to be in recognition of individuals who are leaders or officials in the Confederacy, those who participated in or advocated in favor of slavery, or those who publicly advocated for white supremacy or the oppression of historically marginalized groups.
Sorry, I was on mute. Before we get into the process, I wanted to highlight here that what you see in purple and bolded are the recommended changes that we're proposing to the policy or to the process. But the board has ultimate authority in the approval of school names, but school communities play a major role in the process from the start all the way up through the board's vote and approval. So I want to emphasize too that what we heard in community is that this process remain as something that the school community initiates itself. So the district is not recommending that any school start a renaming process. That work still lies with the school community. So instead, school staff, a neighborhood, parent, community group, or a student group can submit a request with brief rationale for renaming or naming to a school leader. The school leader then reviews and elects to submit the request to the CEO or the CEO's designee for consideration using the Form 1. If the school leader elects not to submit, they should share their feedback to the group that brought the initial request. So the school staff group, the neighborhood group, student group, etc. A meeting is held between the school leader and the requesting group to discuss the decision that was made not to submit. The community can then appeal the decision to the CEO or designee if they choose. Then the decision rests with the CEO to determine whether whether the request will move forward. The next step is sort of two-pronged. Form 1 is shared with key district staff that sort of shepherd this process. For general requests, meaning a school is not going through any changes, OAA typically handles the request by sharing it with the board at a public meeting. When a school is experiencing a change, however, for example, a merger or a relocation, the request is typically handled by O&I or the 21st Century's buildings. And we actually submit that request to the board at a public meeting. This staff group is responsible for letting people know about the request via the board meeting, but they're also responsible for checking in with community throughout the process to ensure that they've really deeply engaged in the research behind the consideration of a name and really included all of the stakeholders that are involved in this process. The staff group is also present at this point and throughout the process to answer any questions that community have and to, provide clarification along the way. After this, the school community really begins its engagement. So we've presented the initial request and now school communities can begin the engagement that is required according to the process. The initial request allows school communities to enter one or many names for recommendations for the school name. But in the engagement process, the school community is collecting more information, both quantitatively and qualitatively. So as they perform research, collecting survey data, conducting interviews, focus groups, and discussions, school communities actually garner support for names that were a part of that initial request, or they're getting more names from the community, more name suggestions from the community. In the next step, we recommended that the provision that any school name for a person or not a person be justified using Form 2. We'll explain this provision in more detail as we move through the coming slides. But what this means is that school communities, as they're collecting name suggestions, they should be deeply considering how each name connects to the identities, experiences, and culture of the students the program serves. Form 2 also helps to guide this sort of process for communities. Key district staff are also there, remember, for that support as well. The next step involves school communities finalizing their name selections, and they do this through voting, through campaigning, and other meetings that they hold. Finally, the school leader submits the FFA Form 2, as well as the details about their community engagement process to the CEO or designee for consideration. The cross-functional team that Angela pointed out even at the beginning, inclusive of O&I, OAA, the Equity Office, our Family and Community Engagement Office, 21st Century, and facilities. This cross-functional district team reviews the submission, and then we present this request for a new name at the final board votes, and then approval is either granted or not granted.
All right. So in these next two slides, I'm going to cover what's currently in the policy in terms of criteria for naming, and then contrast that with what we're proposing to add to the policy to really strengthen this part of the policy. So currently it's really divided into three areas. So naming after geographical areas, naming after deceased individuals, or a naming after a living individual, which can be done for a unique portion of a school facility or a school program. This was just done recently for the athletic complex at Mervo there, but there are other examples. The basketball court was named at Reach a few years ago, things like that. And the requirements here are very vague. And that really is, a shortcoming of the current policy. So, looking at the geographical area, we only ask that the names are clearly identifying, widely known, recognized. When we're talking about individuals, deceased or living, we're just asking that they have a distinguished record of service on a regional, state, or national level, preferably in the Baltimore community. And we just ask that the record of service must be fully documented. So like I said, it's kind of a broad requirement right now. So we want to move towards.
And team, good evening. I
Sure.
don't want to cut us off, but we do have a few additional compliance reports. If we can move through just a little bit faster, the board also has 2 additional meetings tonight after this one. So I want to make sure that we can get through the information, hit those high points, because we're close to the chair's recommended time of 20 minutes for the presentation. So if we could just move it just a little faster so that we can get through the rest of our agenda today, that would be helpful.
Absolutely. Okay, so these are highlights of what we're proposing to change. The form that Monique referenced that schools and communities would complete would include these justification questions to consider. So asking if you can read them here, but just shortly, do they honor the experience, culture, and humanity of our students? How does the school name represent the school community? And then asking if the school has considered names that have been previously used by city schools. As we mentioned earlier, there's some names that have been lost as schools have closed and merged. So these would be the justification questions that must be considered. Then the legacy test questions, these are being included directly in the policy itself, as well as on this form. That's where they can be completed. So here we're asking if the person has an established record of service spanning multiple decades. The second question is asking if they don't have that record, do they have an established record of service and impact that is likely to still be relevant after their death? So by including these 2 questions, we want to leave the option open that we can recognize somebody who has, lived a very long, full life, as well as being able to recognize someone who perhaps died tragically young, but still is worthy of recognition without those multiple decades. And then lastly, and this would apply for people living or not, or dead, have the person's contributions impacted Baltimore residents and or the world in a positive and lasting way. And here we're asking the communities consider if the person's professional and personal life were aligned and how their actions could empower the identity of our students.
Awesome. So I'll share some feedback we actually got from PCAB on the recommended changes. So basically, they noted that the district should work on its process for sharing our policy information publicly. So maybe using student videos to sort of improve the communication about the policy with families. Then they were concerned about the school leader the school leader being the only person to review an initial request. With all of the challenges that our school leaders are facing right now, this can be sort of an additional burden for them. So just recognizing that. The third legacy test question, they had suggestions for how it should be rewritten so that it clearly includes local Baltimoreans who are also impactful. And then they recommended adding in a required timeline for components of the naming process. And then finally, the district office staff, they suggested maybe should have more of a role so that school leaders, again, we're taking some of that burden away from our school leaders in the process.
And just so Monique, if I can just jump in, just to be helpful at the board's request that we go a little faster. We got similar feedback from our student congress. You see that reflected on the slide. They wanted to make sure that we can consider people, that local people were still in consideration. So they gave us some framing that you can read. Can you go to the next slide? Mm-hmm. So this is our BMARME fellows that we talked about. not only did they do that research that is residing on our website that we're working on, but they also created a book that you can scan and take a look at. It includes, it's a poetic anthology where they speak from the perspective of the people that some of our school buildings are named after, as well as from their own perspective. And that's just a look at that website. And this is kind of where we are in the process in terms of next steps. Just want to see if you guys have any questions for us.
Thank you so much for the presentation. And I think one of the things that kind of stood out to me was just kind of one observation, one sort of saying just a broad thank you all. I have just been on some calls with some other school districts where the naming and the renaming issue has been so contentious that it's distracted the school districts from doing the business and some boards from doing the business of the work of sort of governance. And so just a huge thank you, kudos, and the thoughtfulness around putting this together and making sure that, you know, it frees us up and it doesn't become a distraction. So thank you, and it's always been thoughtful. I had two questions, and I don't remember where we landed. So one of them was around, there was some language in the policy, I believe it was around like where we made the additions for the equity policy that were focused in on sort of like white supremacy, addressing the Confederacy, et cetera. And then the last line of other historically marginalized populations. So I thought we had a conversation about like hate speech in sort of just like general broad, like hate entities or anybody who's engaged in sort of hate and practices. I just don't remember where we landed on that, because I imagine that it's not just about white supremacy and so forth. There are other pieces of that, and I just don't remember. Any insights would be helpful.
I think that's good feedback. We were trying to cover that, so maybe we can look at making a revision that would include groups that participate in hate speech or something. So we can play around. I don't know if you had like a specific thought of what we should add there, but we can sort of take that feedback and look at a way to accommodate that, because it's right. We don't want people who are promoting hate of groups of people.
Yeah, and I thought we had to talk. So I guess I didn't put that much thought in because I thought we talked about it. But yeah, so for me, it's around sort of those folks who've engaged in hate, acts of terror or hate against other groups of people. And while I think white supremacy captures a lot of it, but I imagine there are other groups. I'm thinking specifically about LGBT folks and that sort of thing as well. So acts of hate and terror for me is probably what I could, but that might not be the best language. So, but.
That's really helpful.
Commissioner McFadden, did you have any questions before I jumped into my second one?
No, I don't have any questions. I'll just let you go ahead.
Awesome, thank you. And I guess my other and my last question for this was I know that we have a very in-depth process for our mergers and making sure that community members are, you know, we go through a real intensive process. I was just curious about sort of, do we have a process of letting things go, right? So I don't know, how do I express this? It's like, when a school, when we've selected a school, the name has been changed, we went through our process. Is there like a ritual practice for honoring the name that has gone, that is no longer present in that space, or no longer the primary one? And I didn't know if that was possible, if that felt like too much foo-foo, or like what, you know, but like helping people to grieve the loss, you know, is there some way in which we sort of honor sort of the name that was in order to sort of make new for something else? And I just didn't know if that was something that we had.
We've been trying to figure out how to do that well. We will, like, in working with communities, work with our partners and the wellness team to sort of hold space and sort of how we close the program and having opportunities for that. But we've been trying to figure out how to sort of document that history or bring that history somewhat into the new space. So that's part of what we're still trying to figure out, and will be our focus for that phase 4. Some of that will be like on our website, but like also having some of that be real within a school community, because it's sort of the legacy, like schools are sort of the legacy, like, what happens when the school I went to, closes, where do I come back to, or where's that history live? So that's something we're still trying to figure out.
Great, thank you. Well, that's it that I had in terms of questions. Again, thank you all so much for doing incredible work on this, and deeply appreciate the thoughtfulness that has gone into creating a really great process for our naming and renaming, and especially for our mergers as well. Yeah. And so also,
thank you.
Yeah, pardon the noise if y'all hear it. They're still doing construction. We have a bunch of compliance reports that we kind of sort of want to make our way through. And so I just want to begin. Let me change my windows. How about we start in order? The 3.01 compliance report, KCA, family and community engagement. Commissioner McFadden or Vice Chair McFadden, did you have any particular questions here?
I do not.
Okay. And for this one, I do not either. Sort of 3.02 compliance report, KCB volunteers. Do you have anything?
No.
Okay. For 3.03, which is JK behavioral interventions and student discipline.
So I know that with this, I'm just looking at the title of the policy, right? But this particular compliance report gives us information on suspensions primarily. I'm curious to know a little bit more about interventions that happen and that occur. So although, last year was primarily virtual, we did come back into the building for a portion of last school year. I'm curious to know if moving forward, we could see a little bit more information that aligns to the wholeness work that's happening. As far as interventions are concerned, is our primary intervention suspension? And is that how we're managing? Hey, Ms. Hines, is that how we're managing behavior? Or are there other things that can be highlighted or lifted up in this compliance report so that we're able to see a holistic view of not just the policy, but how we are supporting our young people and quite frankly, our communities as a whole?
So certainly, as you stated before, there were very few suspensions last year. For JKA in the past, I remember when I came on as a coordinator, there was no compliance report. And so this compliance report specifically was requested by the board at that time, like when I first came on, and that was the request. The things that we reported in this report were things that were requested of the board at that time. And so that is why the compliance report looks as though it does, because they were specifically interested in the numbers for suspensions. As you also know, as we have revised JKA over the years, we have put a lot more restorative approaches and measures and interventions and preventions in place. And so if that is the pleasure of the board to report on what preventions and interventions we have implemented for that particular year, we certainly can add. But again, when this report was initially requested, this is what was requested in particular, specifically about suspensions.
Appreciate that, and it makes sense what you're saying. Also, it makes sense once we do make revisions and edits and as these policies evolve, I think we should also consider making sure that our compliance reports align, because to your point in your work, right, there's been a lot happening as far as restoration is concerned, wholeness, wellness, holistic approaches to supporting our young people. It's important that we we're going to see it when we get like these larger updates on like maybe 3R or just like the state of the school, like all of that. But in compliance reports like this, it would be nice to see, to your point, a little bit more as it relates to the restoration and how we are providing interventions as it relates to the community index, right? Like what specific interventions are happening more or less in specific communities, particularly grade levels. Where are we seeing, trends and specific behaviors, and what are we doing to support those particular grade bands or those particular communities? In addition to suspensions, right? It's just suspensions for me is not the end all, right, be all, when there's been so much work put in place to support our students along the way. So I really want us to make sure that we're highlighting the work that is actually happening in city schools beyond just, what we see in this as it relates to suspensions. And I get why you did it, but just moving forward, that would be helpful.
Absolutely. And one of the numbers that we can highlight for you is we have a new position in our office this year, and it is it's called the Safety Conferencing Specialist. So there is a support that has been added. There's a position, a full-time position, and that is strictly what she does. She has mediations with families and schools here at the district office level to try to mediate situations before they escalate and become suspension. So we can certainly, that's one of the things that we can highlight, one of the supports that we're offering here at district in order to prevent the suspension numbers.
Thank you.
Yep.
And I think sort of in that same vein, also thinking about for the future compliance reports, the diversions, right? So it sounds like you just named one of the diversions. I think I have Chief Ham's sort of diversion framework in my 4 levels in the back of my brain. Also, so what does this look like for the preventive spaces? And so we have a mediator. That's sort of like one way in which we kind of begin to sort of divert folks. And so from your perspective, do you see other areas where we're creating sort of alternate pathways so that suspension is not sort of our primary focus area? And if so, what are they, and how might you think about including them in sort of a next round for the compliance report?
So another intervention that we have, and that is specifically with talking about disproportionality with suspensions. We have a very close connection with the Office of Special Ed. So whenever a suspension is called into our office, and suspensions that are called into our office are either long-term, which are 4 to 10 days, or 11 to 44 days, which are extended suspensions. Whenever a suspension is called into our office for approval, before it is given an approval, I consult with the discipline specialist. So there is an additional discipline specialist that has been added down in Deborah Brooks's office. And so again, that position and we talk on a daily basis. Anyone that has an IEP that is being referred for long-term or an extended, again, suspension, we consult. And sometimes it is not a suspension that is needed for that student. Sometimes we create other interventions or strategies, or we may have to hold a meeting that one of the specialists will have to attend so that we can divert that student, because suspension is not the best solution. So we do that on a daily basis as well.
That's really helpful.
Just an example of.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I think sort of, again, what I'm thinking about sort of what is the story that we do tell. And so I think it really is something to say that we have diverted X, Y, and Z numbers of students from this particular space. And I think sort of having that to be tied to sort of our sort of justice approaches as a broader framework, how does that begin to situate us to get sort of greater funding and resources in to see if one, if those are best practices, and then 2, if they are, how do we begin to scale them and make sure that you all have the resources that you need to keep up the incredible work. And so I think from my perspective, having, so we might not see it now, but we're clearly doing things that might demonstrate to other communities similar to ours with similar populations how important it is to, one, the biggest frame is to break the school to prison pipeline, but then I think more centrally using these as these non-punitive practices and how they impact our students and our communities and families. And so I think for me, that was kind of what I think for the next round of compliance for those sorts of things. And I guess if there are, if you all have thoughts about what could go in there and sort of get those to Christian so that we can, I think we'll have some thoughts and we can think about that. But also if you have thoughts around sort of like, I think it might be important for you all to see how many numbers of students by race that we've diverted or gotten out of this particular thing versus another would be really helpful.
Okay.
Yeah. Awesome. I don't have anything else, Commissioner McFadden. Anything from you? Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And so let's see, where are we now? We're at 3.04 employee evaluations. And did you have any questions here, Commissioner McFadden?
If you have some, I'll let you start. I'll go through this again, Dr. Brooks.
Yeah, so I think it would be really helpful for me to get a little bit more understanding around sort of lessons and insights. And so when I looked at the compliance report, and I thought all of it was really informative, but I'm trying to find the page. Can someone talk to me a little bit about sort of what this system allowed for? There was some talk about the differentiation between allowing us to see in this off-cycle how many teachers were operating at a 4 and a 3, and sort of it mattered there, but it didn't necessarily matter at the other level. So if anybody could just help me understand a little bit more about how this process helped elucidate those distinctions would be helpful as a starting place.
Hi, good evening. Okay, let me turn my camera on. This is Jessie Papia. I'm the Director of Employee Effectiveness. So let me know if I'm not answering your question, Dr. Brooks, and I do apologize. When we piloted the off-cycle opportunity, this was the first time where teachers who had a demonstrated history of high performance were able to be off-cycle. And so when we think about those levels of 3 and 4, what we saw is that these were folks who tended to have higher ratings on their observations. They made a decision to be off-cycle and participate in the pilot, and it meant that their professional practice data from the year prior was included in their annual evaluation. So it feels technical, but the outcome was that it meant not all of our school leaders didn't have to formally observe folks who had this history of high performance. Those teachers didn't engage in the formal observation process. And our goal here was both to acknowledge folks and their history of performance and create more time and space for more informal observations. And some of that formative feedback that we've heard teachers really value, and there's not always as much time for.
Great, thank you. From your perspective, in terms of insights and sort of like, what does this really mean for us as a district? If you could talk to me about like the particular implications, at least from how you see it from the data around how we might be different because of this experience, that would be really helpful. I'm just curious.
Yeah, I appreciate that so much. And I think we're going to have more learning to do. This is new for us. A couple of the things that come to mind, and based on feedback, and we did a survey, heard from hundreds of folks who had participated, did summer input sessions as well. Some of the things that people said, one is just teachers really felt valued and seen by this acknowledgement of us saying, we know that you have done well in the past, and we're differentiating our approach with you. That felt, I think people felt really valued in that way. Again, this idea, and we heard from school leaders and staff in their survey responses that they did agree that there was an increase in capacity for informal observations. I'd say there's still work to be done because there is so much that can fill the cup for a school leader. This is just one piece in space that my team interacts with in particular. But people did agree that there was an increase in capacity for informal observations. I think that by acknowledging folks in this way, one of our hopes, people agreed that it made sense that people who are off cycle may be able to support others, even in informal ways, opening up their classroom, not wanting it to be a requirement. But I think if we start to create this culture where we see you, we acknowledge that there's a strong history, we're hoping we create space for you to help, pour into others' buckets as well. We're hoping that, we can build on that. One thing I will say from my perspective that we want to, I think, avoid is an unintended consequence where some of our highest performing teachers aren't getting feedback more regularly because we're not requiring or monitoring it in the same way. So far, people said, in their first year that had not occurred. But I would say that, from my perspective, we don't want to have all of the best intentions and have an unintended consequence for our highest performing teachers. So I think it's something we just want to monitor through feedback surveys.
Great, really helpful context. Thank you. And Commissioner Fadden, did you have anything?
I like to see the trend over years, right? So what we primarily received in this particular compliance report was last year. Are we able to see a trend over years for the different ratings, if that makes sense?
Yeah, so whether or not folks were off cycle, but just in general, teacher annual evaluation ratings over time. Yep. I mean, we can certainly respond to that in particular for here. And then would I be accurate in taking that as feedback for future compliance reports, wanting to have something that shows over time?
I think it would be helpful just for us to see the differences and then how we can just support, moving forward. Or we're using the word divert. Is that a word tonight? Resources. But I'm probably using it incorrectly. I'm tired. But just making sure that we're allocating resources in the most effective ways to support our staff members to do their best work for our children and our community. So I think it would be helpful to see the comparison from year to year. And last year was an interesting year, so it would be interesting to see how we move forward to kind of guide further discussion and decision making.
Yep, absolutely. We can do that. And I can also provide that so you don't have to wait a year for some of that information. One thing I'll add is, and I don't want to say anything beyond a year ago because I don't want to be inaccurate, but at least from 1920 to 2021, we did see a slight increase in the percentage of teachers who are highly effective, but we'll be able to give more detail and show you some trends over time.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you.
And do you have any insights particularly around demographics of the folks who went through this pilot? Was it equally broken down by race and gender? And did we see any disparities or differences in outcomes that you could share with us?
Thank you for that. We need to look into more. Some of that breakout. Our initial focus had been looking at by teacher performance in general, and then the CCI for the schools and the students served. But in terms of looking at in particular for the off-cycle opportunity, if we're seeing, how did it look across CCI schools? How did it look for teacher demographic? That gives us more to pursue. We can provide an update once we've done that.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
And I just have one last question, and it's around like sort of the assistant principals, and can you share like any sort of reflections on sort of what you've learned as it relates specifically to our principals and our assistant principals, and how sort of having been, I don't want to say this, how their experience and sort of their rating of their sort of participation in sort of what is it freed up for them or anything like that? Like, what were there any insights around sort of like how well sort of they were operating or functioning or anything like that? I'm just curious. I'm not sure, I think our principals and assistant principals, and I think about our pipelines, and I think about how important it is to have strong pipelines. And so I'm just trying to make some connections. I just don't know enough about sort of what this experience might have meant, particularly for our assistant principals and principals.
Yep. And just to clarify, do you mean the experience as supervisors of teachers who are off cycle, or their experience in their own evaluation last year?
I think in their own evaluation. Yeah. So I see, we have a similar table breakdown in the compliance report.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things around our school leader evaluations. I will say it definitely was coming to us around the mid-year, because if we're thinking about January, February, right, folks have they've lifted their schools into a virtual learning environment, which was just, phenomenal. They're then looking into the next budget season, evaluation cycle for teachers, getting ready for what may come. And, we knew that coming up was going to be a shift back to some in-person or hybrid learning. So with all of that, I will say, school leaders acknowledge some sense of just how much lift everything was last year. I don't think evaluation alone, but evaluation becomes part of it because you're talking about practice. We tried there to accommodate at the mid-year by having, I'd say, a more concise, focused mid-year conversation for folks so that they could still get feedback but not have to go as deep as they normally would with everything going on. I would say that, from what we've seen with our school leaders, the breakout for their evaluation ratings tends to follow more of a normal bell curve. We did see, I'd say, a little bit higher ratings on the professional practice side. I think a lot of that had to do with ILEDs and supervisors acknowledging just the hero's effort on behalf of school leaders and our educators, and that acknowledgement. So that's some of the stuff that I'm thinking of when I recall last year, and just wanting to acknowledge, it is a very big lift to be a school leader in any district and in our district in last year. And so we wanted to find ways where people felt acknowledged and seen, and if we could alleviate some work on their plate, if we could do that thoughtfully.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Any other things before we move on, Commissioner? Awesome.
Thank you both.
Thank you. So we are at anything around sort of the grants physical reporting for you, Commissioner McFadden? Okay. And I think for this one, one of the questions that I had specifically, I wasn't quite sure what the full scope I was looking at in terms of the grants. And so was this kind of like all of the grants that sort of we had in or that was active at that time period? And then also how much of this was related to like COVID and COVID funds and that sort of thing would be just a little bit helpful context.
Yes, hi. Good afternoon, everyone.
Hi.
Yeah, so hi. Yeah, so it was the totality of the grants that were active in FY21. And so it does include the COVID relief grants. The grants that begin with a number 4566 or 4567 are currently the COVID relief funding. So, you can hear me?
It's breaking up a little bit. So I'm going to.
I'm having a little trouble as well hearing you.
Okay, let me take the earbuds out. How about now?
I can hear you a little bit better, and I also turned off.
Okay, let me turn the volume up. Can you hear me okay now?
Now I can.
Okay. Yeah, so the report was the totality of grants that were in the FY21 fiscal year. So it did include the COVID relief grants. Any currently begins with 4566 or 4577 shown on the report is a COVID relief grant. as well. You can see it in the grant name as well. And so the 3 breakouts of the grants that were active in FY21, it listed the current grants that came into the district in FY21, school year 2021, and then it listed any carryover grants that were still operating that entered the district in a prior fiscal year. And then it included any grants that had expired or were being closed out. So that represented the entire fiscal year 21 grant data.
Thank you. And I think one of the things that feels particularly important, as I was looking at, I was trying to figure out what the structure for the. You can't hear me?
It's just, I'm not sure what's happening. I don't know if it's just me, but I'm hearing like a lot of I don't know if it's you, Dr. Brooks, on the camera off. Maybe that might.
Yeah, I turned off my camera up. Yeah, it's going to Fritz. No, I can't hear you, Renee.
Okay. How about now?
Okay, yes.
Okay.
Can you hear me fine?
I can hear you, yes.
Awesome, great. So we maybe just needed some more bandwidth. And I know we only have a few minutes left, and I'm not sure, I'm not the most informed in terms of like what is the most easily identifiable way to sort of like express sort of the grants that we came in. And so I think one of the things that I was looking for in this particular compliance report, if it was for everything that came in, sort of having some summary at the top, some written summary, not about, because there's a whole bunch of grants that are at the bottom, but I don't necessarily know all what they mean. But I was thinking specifically around what feels important is for mental health grants or anything was around our restorative justice, particular pieces. And I think, and I'm not even sure if you would be the best person to actually like sort of tell a story about those grants and sort of like how they're how they're used.
Yeah, yeah, I'm actually not. It would be the actual grant manager when you get into different programs, because each grant will have a whole host of cost centers that have budgets on the grant and a whole host of programs. So the individual grant manager can speak more specifically about what's happening in the actual program. I just presented the fiscal data.
Great. And do you, Christian?
Sorry, I think there's a little bit of, can everybody hear me?
Now I can.
Now you can. Okay, great. And Commissioner Brooks, I was going to add, we had some conversations earlier in the year about perhaps providing the board, some kind of summary of grants and the outcomes that are known. So what I'll do is, in my meeting with the chief of staff, I'll just follow up on that. But it sounds like you want to know more, right? Not only what are the grants are, but what are we doing with them?
Yeah. And I was like, well, I don't know if Renee should be the one that's doing that because that piece, but I think sort of what would feel important is like how much of this is like, what is this going to in a very digestible way? And sort of what insights or learning or not just a spin down, but like, I think which is important for our district, but just like, what do they really mean for us? Who are we able to serve? How many as a result of getting those additional resources in through grants? Understood.
I don't personally think that would be the place for this particular compliance report, but I do think it's good information, so I'll definitely flag it for follow-up.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. Renee, so thank you so much for this compliance report. And I don't have any more questions for that.
Okay, thank you.
So we have about 7 minutes left. And compliance report 3.06 around sort of the curriculum management plan. Commissioner McFadden, did you have anything here? Or you might have come through committee already?
No, I don't have specific questions. I appreciate just the flagging for what we're going to see a little later in the year, so I don't have specific questions about it now. I do know that we go through curriculum review cycles. We're in a cycle, so every year there's a different set that we either review or approve. So I see that there will be more information coming to us in the future. I don't have any questions.
Great, thank you. I think the only piece that I had, and I think we got this a little bit earlier in our other presentation around sort of our health education components, and again, making sure that throughout all of our curriculum, it's being inclusive of all identities, particularly our LGBTQ students and so forth. So nothing beyond that. And I know that we have staff working on that already. And I guess our compliance report 3.07, which is around our homeless students. So I mean, beyond just kind of being sort of always alarmed so this is my second time, I think, seeing these rates of homelessness in our students. Is it possible for us to, I think we've actually had this conversation before, and please forgive me, we have. I know so much of the money, the allocated additional resources goes to transportation of our students, and while there's a whole host of other pieces there, I don't remember if there were limitations as to why that or restrictions on the other areas of funding and supporting our homeless students. But I guess my question here is, based on what we know and sort of how transportation was impacted by COVID-19, what does this mean for those funds for our particular students? Was it reallocated, repurposed? Any insights? And I know we only have 4 minutes, so just anything that folks could share.
Hi, Louise Fink speaking. How are you today? We don't really allocate the funds for homeless because they are a district contribution to what we are doing. We're very grateful. We have been given many more funds this year and more things that we're doing. So we've expanded the amount of support we're giving to families and students. We're doing more clothing. We're doing more good winter coats, shoes, things like that to make sure they have what they need. We pay for events when events come along that students have to be at. And we are working now on a new grant which will help us do some emergency housing for the first time, and we hope that's going to work out. We'd be very happy to report back on that once that is confirmed. At this particular point, I continue to be upset every day at the idea of 3,400 students in the district being homeless. It seems like it's an appalling number, and we all work very hard. We've added some additional supports in our team itself. We have an LBGT coordinator to work with some of the students who are on the street because they've been put out. We have a coordinator working right now with ELL students because the district is 8% ELL, but the homeless population is 29% ELL. So we have a bilingual person working with them, and we're doing a lot to try to help it, but all of us are trying to work together to make sure that that core problem, people not being in homes, is alleviated, and that's where we're working.
Great, thank you so much for all of the hard work, and yeah, it's a lot. Also just want to nod to the I think additional supports when I looked at the students who experience homelessness having higher NCs, and so I'm sure Dr. Browski and everyone else is sort of creating a coordinated plan to make sure that those students get the educational support that they need, but just kind of wanted to raise those differences as well.
Yes, and one of the things we've been doing even during the pandemic this year is we provided tutoring support in the shelters, tutoring support after school, and a lot of in-person types of things even in the middle of COVID to make sure that some of our homeless students didn't get left behind. It's an uphill battle though.
Yeah, thank you so much. And we are at time, and I know there's a lot of events for the rest of the evening for some of the board members. So I just again want to thank everyone for coming, and thank you all for participating in and putting the compliance reports together, and then also sharing insights and reflections on them. Our next meeting is scheduled for December the 21st at 3:30 p.m. and it will be a virtual meeting. There we'll be discussing staff travel reimbursement policy and then KDA access to public records as well, and a compliance report sort of around our anaphylaxis JLCDB. Just a reminder that all of our events are public. All of our meetings are public. If folks would like to sign up in advance, they're able to do so beginning 9 a.m. on the Thursday before our meeting until 5 p.m. The Monday before the meeting date. Please reach out to our board office and via email or by phone. And with that being said, I would like to sort of conclude our meeting for today. Thank you all so much and see you at our next policy meeting in December. Thank you.